Right now, you're holding paper that everyone agrees is valuable. But why? 100 years ago, that paper was backed by actual gold sitting in a vault. Today, it's backed by, well, trust. And somehow, one country's paper money became so powerful that it controls global trade, topples governments, and makes nations bend to its will. This isn't just about currency. It's about the most successful transfer of power in human history. How did we go from weighing gold coins to swiping cards? And why does the American dollar rule them all? The answer will change how you see every transaction you make. Money is the ultimate illusion that became reality. Throughout human history, we've agreed that certain objects hold value. First shells, then metal, then paper, and now digital numbers on a screen. But here's what most people don't realize. Each evolution of money wasn't just a technological upgrade. It was a power grab. Whoever controlled the money system controlled the world. For thousands of years, gold was the ultimate arbiter of value. Kings hoarded it. Empires fought wars over it. It was heavy, rare, and impossible to fake. Gold didn't need anyone's permission to be valuable. It just was. Then something extraordinary happened. We convinced ourselves that paper representing gold was just as good as gold itself. And then, in a move that would reshape global power forever, we abandoned gold entirely. Today, the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, even though it's not backed by anything tangible. No gold, no silver, nothing but the full faith and credit of the United States government. How did this happen? How did one nation's paper money become so dominant that countries around the world keep billions of dollars in reserve, price their oil in dollars, and tie their economic fate to American monetary policy? This is the story of money's evolution from physical metal to abstract concept, and how that evolution concentrated more power than any empire in history. It's a story of gold rushes and bank vaults, of presidential decisions and global consequences. Let's follow the money. Before we dive deeper into this fascinating story, I want to hear from you. What do you think about our modern monetary system? Do you trust paper money backed by nothing but government promises? Or do you think we should return to something more tangible? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're finding this video eye-opening, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this series on how money really works. Now, let's continue. The gold standard era. For most of human civilization, money had to be something with intrinsic value. You couldn't just declare that a piece of bark was worth a cow. It had to be something rare, durable, divisible, and universally desired. Gold and silver fit the bill perfectly. By the time ancient civilizations like Lydia in modern-day Turkey minted the first standardized coins around 600 BCE, the concept was clear. Money should be made of something valuable in itself. This principle dominated for over 2,000 years. When nations traded, they traded in gold and silver. When governments wanted to spend more than they collected in taxes, they had to have the precious metal to back it up. This created a natural constraint on government power. You couldn't just print your way to prosperity. You needed actual gold in your vaults. The formal gold standard as we know it emerged in the 19th century. Britain adopted it officially in 1821, and by the 1870s, most major economies followed suit. The rules were simple. Every unit of currency represented a specific amount of gold, and anyone holding that currency could, in theory, exchange it for the actual metal. A British pound, an American dollar, or a French franc wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a claim check for gold sitting in a government vault. This system had profound implications. It meant that international exchange rates were essentially fixed by the gold content of each currency. If a British pound contained a certain amount of gold and an American dollar contained another amount, the exchange rate between them was mathematically determined. There was no speculation about whether the pound would be stronger or weaker next week. Gold settled all accounts. The gold standard also imposed discipline on governments. If a nation wanted to increase its money supply, it needed to acquire more gold. This usually meant running a trade surplus, discovering new gold deposits, or conquering territories with gold mines. Britain's dominance of global trade in the 19th century meant gold flowed to London, making the British pound the de facto international currency of the era. The sun never set on the British Empire, and gold never stopped flowing into British coffers. But the system had a fatal flaw: rigidity. When economic crises hit, governments found themselves handcuffed. They couldn't increase the money supply to fight unemployment or stimulate growth because they didn't have enough gold. The gold standard meant that economic policy was dictated not by human needs, but by the availability of a shiny metal. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, this rigidity became intolerable. Countries that abandoned the gold standard early, like Britain in 1931, recovered faster than those that clung to it longer, like the United States and France. World War I dealt the first major blow to the international gold standard. Nations needed to finance massive military expenditures, and they couldn't do it within the constraints of gold-backed money. They suspended convertibility, printed money, and inflated their way through the war. After the war, there were attempts to restore the gold standard, but the system was already crumbling. The economic devastation of the Great Depression finished it off. Yet even as the pure gold standard died, gold remained central to the international monetary system. The question was no longer whether gold mattered, but how much gold mattered and who controlled it. As World War II raged, the world's economic powers began planning for what would come next. They knew the old system was broken, but they also knew that money needed some anchor, some connection to reality. The stage was set for a new arrangement that would reshape global power for the next century. And it would be negotiated not in London, the old financial capital of the world, but in a small resort town in the mountains of New Hampshire, where the future of money would be decided by the victors of war. The Bretton Woods system. In July 1944, as Allied forces pushed through France and the outcome of World War II became clear, representatives from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their mission was to design the post-war economic order. Britain, though still a major power, was economically exhausted. The United States, by contrast, emerged from the war as an industrial colossus, holding about 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. The balance of power had shifted decisively across the Atlantic. The British delegation, led by the brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes, proposed an innovative system based on an international currency called the Bancor. This would have created a truly global monetary system, not dependent on any single nation's currency. It was a bold vision of economic multilateralism, but the Americans, led by Harry Dexter White, had different ideas. They had the gold, they had the industrial capacity, and they had the military might. They weren't about to relinquish the advantages that position gave them. The compromise that emerged was elegant in its simplicity and revolutionary in its implications. The US dollar would become the world's reserve currency, convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Every other currency would peg itself to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate. In essence, the world adopted a gold standard, but with the dollar as the intermediary. Instead of every nation holding massive gold reserves, they could hold dollars, trusting that the United States would honor its commitment to exchange those dollars for gold on demand. This system, known as Bretton Woods, meant that the US dollar became as good as gold. If you were a German manufacturer selling goods to Japan, you'd accept payment in dollars, knowing you could always convert them to gold if needed. The dollar became the universal medium of exchange, the unit in which international prices were quoted, and the asset in which central banks around the world held their reserves. For the United States, this arrangement was extraordinarily advantageous. American companies could buy foreign goods and assets simply by printing dollars. As long as other countries were willing to hold those dollars rather than immediately redeem them for gold, the United States could run persistent trade deficits without the usual consequences. Economists would later call this the exorbitant privilege of having the world's reserve currency. The system worked remarkably well through the 1950s and early 1960s. War-torn economies rebuilt themselves, international trade flourished, and the dollar's dominance seemed unassailable. But there was a fundamental contradiction at the heart of Bretton Woods, and it would eventually tear the system apart. This contradiction was identified by economist Robert Triffin and became known as the Triffin dilemma. Here was the problem. For the world economy to grow, it needed an increasing supply of dollars to facilitate trade and serve as reserves. But the more dollars the United States created and sent abroad, the more the ratio of dollars to American gold reserves deteriorated. Eventually, the world would hold more dollar claims than the United States had gold to back them. The system was designed to fail from the beginning. By the late 1960s, the contradictions were becoming acute. The United States was fighting an expensive war in Vietnam while simultaneously pursuing ambitious domestic programs under President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. These expenditures required printing more dollars, and those dollars flowed overseas. Other countries, particularly France under President Charles de Gaulle, began to notice that American gold reserves could no longer cover the number of dollars in circulation abroad. De Gaulle, always suspicious of American power, began converting France's dollar reserves into gold, putting pressure on the system. American gold reserves declined from over 20,000 tons at the end of World War II to under 9,000 tons by 1971. Other nations watched nervously, wondering whether they should also redeem their dollars for gold before the vault was empty. The situation was unsustainable. Something had to give. And on a Sunday evening in August 1971, President Richard Nixon would make a decision that would fundamentally alter the nature of money itself. The Nixon Shock and the birth of fiat currency. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon interrupted regular television programming to make an announcement that would change economic history. Facing a run on American gold reserves and unable to maintain the dollar's convertibility to gold at $35 per ounce, Nixon unilaterally suspended the dollar's convertibility to gold. What he presented as a temporary measure became permanent. The Bretton Woods system was dead, and a new era had begun. Nixon tried to downplay the significance of his decision, framing it as a defense against international speculators. But make no mistake, this was one of the most consequential economic decisions of the 20th century. For the first time in human history, the world's dominant currency was backed by nothing tangible. The dollar's value rested entirely on trust in the U.S. government and the American economy. Money had become purely fiat currency, valuable by government decree rather than intrinsic worth. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Exchange rates, which had been fixed for decades, now floated freely. Currencies rose and fell based on market forces rather than gold content. The world had entered a new era of floating exchange rates where the value of money changed by the minute. Economists and policymakers worried that this would lead to monetary instability, hyperinflation, and economic chaos. Their fears weren't entirely unfounded. The 1970s witnessed significant inflation across the developed world, partly driven by oil price shocks, but also by the removal of gold's disciplining effect on monetary policy. When money was tied to gold, governments couldn't just print unlimited amounts, but in the fiat currency era, the only limits on money creation were political will and fear of inflation. Many governments proved they had little of either. Yet something remarkable happened. The dollar didn't collapse. Despite no longer being convertible to gold, despite persistent U.S. trade deficits, despite America's declining industrial dominance, the dollar retained its position as the world's reserve currency. How? The answer lies in a combination of factors that made the dollar indispensable even without gold backing. First, the sheer size and liquidity of U.S. financial markets meant that anyone holding dollars could easily buy or sell assets denominated in dollars. Second, the dollar's use as the invoicing currency for global commodities, especially oil, created constant demand for dollars. Third, the United States maintained the world's most powerful military, ensuring that the geopolitical system supporting dollar dominance remained intact. And fourth, there was no viable alternative. The euro wouldn't exist for another 3 decades, and no other currency had the depth, liquidity, and trust necessary to serve as a global reserve. The petrodollar system, established through agreements with Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing nations in the 1970s, became particularly important. Oil, the most traded commodity in the world, was priced and sold in dollars. This meant that every nation needed dollars to buy energy, creating structural demand for American currency, regardless of whether it was backed by gold. In exchange for pricing oil in dollars, the United States provided military protection to oil-producing states. It was a brilliant arrangement that ensured dollar dominance even after the gold standard's demise. This new system had profound implications for American power. The United States could now run persistent trade deficits without the constraints that would cripple other nations. When Americans bought foreign goods, they paid with dollars. Those dollars would often end up in foreign central banks or used to buy U.S. Treasury bonds, effectively lending the money back to America. The United States could consume more than it produced, maintain a global military presence, and finance it all by printing money that the rest of the world was eager to hold. Critics called this imperialism by other means. The dollar's dominance meant that American economic policies had global consequences, yet other nations had no vote in American elections. When the Federal Reserve raised or lowered interest rates to manage the American economy, it sent shockwaves through developing nations. When the U.S. government imposed financial sanctions, it could effectively cut countries off from the global financial system because that system ran on dollars. The dollar's modern dominance and future challenges. Today, the U.S. dollar's dominance is staggering. Roughly 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. About 88% of foreign exchange transactions involve the dollar. Most international commodities, from oil to gold itself, are priced in dollars. The dollar is truly the sun around which the global financial system orbits. This dominance gives the United States power that would make ancient empires envious. When the U.S. imposes financial sanctions, it can effectively exclude entire nations from the global financial system. Iran, Russia, North Korea, and Venezuela have all felt the weight of dollar-based sanctions. Because international banks need access to the dollar system to operate globally, they comply with American sanctions even when their own governments disagree with U.S. policy. The dollar has become a weapon. The mechanics of dollar dominance touch nearly every aspect of global commerce. A Japanese company buying Brazilian soybeans typically conducts the transaction in dollars. A Chinese manufacturer selling electronics to Germany invoices in dollars. This isn't because these transactions involve the United States, but because the dollar provides a common denominator, deep liquidity, and trust in value stability. The dollar's ubiquity is self-reinforcing. Everyone uses it because everyone uses it. But the system isn't without its critics or challengers. Many nations chafe under American financial hegemony, particularly when U.S. foreign policy conflicts with their interests. When the United States froze Afghanistan's central bank reserves in 2021 or confiscated Russian assets in 2022, it reminded the world that dollar holdings are subject to American political decisions. This has accelerated efforts to create alternatives. China has been the most aggressive in pursuing de-dollarization. The digital yuan, bilateral trade agreements that bypass the dollar, and the internationalization of the renminbi are all part of a long-term strategy to reduce dollar dependence. The European Union, too, has expressed frustration with dollar dominance, particularly when American sanctions force European companies to stop doing business with sanctioned countries despite EU opposition. The rise of cryptocurrencies represents another potential challenge to dollar hegemony, though their extreme volatility and lack of institutional backing has so far prevented them from seriously threatening traditional currencies. What cryptocurrencies have demonstrated is that money can be purely digital, borderless, and operate outside traditional banking systems. This technological possibility has implications for the future of money. Perhaps the most significant recent development has been the emergence of central bank digital currencies. China has already launched a digital yuan, and dozens of other countries are exploring or piloting their own digital currencies. These represent a potential evolution as significant as the move from gold to paper money. Digital currencies could eventually allow direct international transactions without correspondent banking relationships, potentially reducing the dollar's role as an intermediary currency. Yet despite these challenges, the dollar's position remains remarkably secure. The United States still has the world's largest economy, the deepest financial markets, the most transparent legal system, and the most powerful military. The dollar's network effects, everyone uses it because everyone uses it, create enormous inertia. Replacing the dollar would require not just an alternative currency, but an alternative financial architecture, legal framework, and geopolitical order. History suggests that reserve currency status can last for generations, but isn't permanent. The Spanish dollar dominated for centuries, then the Dutch guilder, then the British pound. Each transition coincided with shifts in economic and military power. The question isn't whether the dollar will eventually be replaced, but when and by what. What we're witnessing is unprecedented in human history, a truly global monetary system based on nothing but trust in a single nation's government. Money has completed its evolution from physical commodity to pure abstraction. The dollar's value exists because we collectively agree it exists, backed not by gold in a vault but by the full faith and credit of the United States and the global system it anchors. From gold coins you could bite to digital numbers on a screen, from intrinsic value to pure trust, money has become the ultimate social technology, and whoever controls that technology controls the world. That's the power of money in the modern age, invisible, abstract, and more powerful than ever.